In the winter of 1946, a group of American scientists sat down across a table from a Japanese man they knew had killed thousands of people. They knew about the frostbite experiments. They knew about the plague bombs. They knew what he had done to the prisoners strapped to the tables inside a compound in occupied China. And they knew that most of those prisoners had died screaming. And still, they poured him a drink, opened their notebooks, and asked him to teach them everything. His name was Shiro Ishii, and he was arguably the most prolific mass murderer of the 20th century you have never heard of. He was a doctor by training, a general by rank, and a butcher by profession. Under his direction, a secret military program cut open living human beings, injected them with disease, froze their limbs solid, and studied how long it took a man to die when you removed his stomach without anesthetic. The victims were counted in the thousands. Some estimates, once you include the villages he deliberately infected, run into the hundreds of thousands. And when the war ended, when the men who ran the death camps of Europe were being hunted down and hanged, Shiro Ishii walked into his own home in Japan, sat down with his family, and lived. He was never tried. He was never imprisoned. He died an old man in his own bed of natural causes, with a full life behind him. The reason why is one of the darkest bargains any government has ever made, and the country that made it was the United States.
This is the story of how that happened, and why the men who could have delivered justice chose instead to shake his hand. Shiro Ishii was born in 1922 in a village in Chiba Prefecture into a wealthy landowning family. From the beginning, people who knew him described a strange kind of intensity. He was brilliant, arrogant, and relentless, the sort of student who impressed his professors and irritated nearly everyone else. He studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, and he did not simply pass through it, he consumed it. Classmates recalled him working through the night, reading textbooks that had nothing to do with his coursework, absorbing bacteriology with a hunger that unsettled the men around him. He was also a shameless flatterer of power. Ishii understood early that talent alone would carry him only so far in the rigid hierarchy of the Japanese Imperial Army, so he attached himself to influential officers, married the daughter of the university president, and cultivated the kind of connections that turn an ambitious doctor into a man with an army behind him. Those who worked under him later described a man of contradictions, capable of great personal charm the one moment and cold indifference the next, generous to those who served his ambitions and pitiless toward everyone else. He could dominate a room, and he could just as easily disappear behind a mask of bureaucratic politeness when it suited him.
In the late 1920s, the Army sent him abroad on a 2-year tour of Europe and North America, and that journey shaped everything that followed. He studied the aftermath of the First World War, and in particular the way poison gas had been used in the trenches and then outlawed by international agreement. Where others saw a weapon the world had chosen to ban, Ishii saw something different. He reasoned that if the great powers had gone to the trouble of banning a weapon, it must be because they feared it, and if they feared it, it must work. He returned to Japan convinced that biological weapons, still barely regulated and poorly understood, were the future, and that the nation which mastered them first would hold a decisive edge. By the time he came home, he had a vision, and he began selling it to the generals who mattered. His argument was simple and seductive. Japan, he said, was a nation poor in natural resources, but rich in scientific minds. In any coming war, it could not hope to outproduce its enemies in steel and oil. But there was one weapon that did not require vast factories or endless raw material, a weapon that could be grown in a laboratory, multiplied endlessly, and unleashed on an enemy population without firing a single shell. Disease. Ishii wanted Japan to build the most advanced biological weapons program on Earth, and he wanted to run it himself. The military listened. In a country marching steadily toward total war, a man promising a cheap, invisible superweapon found an eager audience. And so, in the early 1930s, Shiro Ishii was given money, land, and something far more valuable than either. He was given permission to operate without limits, in a place where the rules of the civilized world would never reach him. That place was Manchuria, the vast region of northeastern China that Japan had seized and turned into a puppet state. Far from Tokyo, far from journalists, far from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions, Ishii built his empire. It began modestly and grew into something monstrous. By the end of the decade, near the town of Pingfang outside Harbin, there stood a sprawling complex of more than 150 buildings, ringed by high walls and guarded like a fortress. Officially, it was a water purification and disease prevention department. Its cover name was deliberately dull, forgettable, bureaucratic. History would come to know it by the designation stamped on its paperwork, Unit 731. The complex had everything a small city needs and a few things no city should ever have. It had barracks and laboratories, a power plant and an airfield, dormitories for the scientists, and even a bar and a sports ground to keep morale high. It also had a prison block at its heart, and it had crematoria to dispose of what the prison block produced. Ishii was not building a research station, he was building a factory, and the raw material fed into it was people. The prisoners came from everywhere the Japanese secret police could reach. Chinese resistance fighters, suspected spies, petty criminals, ordinary farmers rounded up in sweeps, Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, men, women, and children. Once they arrived at Pingfang, they ceased to be human beings in the eyes of the men who ran the place. The staff had a word for them. They called them maruta, which means logs. It began as a grim joke, a play on the facility's cover story as a lumber mill, but the word stuck because it captured something true about how the prisoners were seen, not as patients, not even as prisoners, as material, as logs to be processed. What was done to them inside those walls is difficult to write and harder to read, but it cannot be softened without lying about what happened. Prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, and dysentery, then dissected while still alive so that researchers could observe the progress of the disease in fresh tissue before decomposition set in. Anesthetic was frequently withheld, partly out of cruelty and partly because Ishii's men believed it might contaminate their results. Living people had their organs removed, their limbs amputated and reattached to the wrong sides of their bodies, their blood drained and replaced with animal blood to see how long they would survive. In the frozen Manchurian winters, prisoners were taken outside, their bare arms and legs doused with water and exposed to the air until the flesh froze solid. Then the researchers would strike the frozen limbs with a stick to hear the sound, a hard, hollow crack that told them the tissue had turned to ice. Then they would study the process of thawing, the gangrene, the rot, in the name of understanding frostbite in soldiers. Women were deliberately infected with syphilis and forced into pregnancies so that the transmission of disease to unborn children could be observed. Prisoners were locked in pressure chambers and the air slowly removed until their bodies gave out. Others were used as living targets to test flamethrowers and grenades. None of this was random sadism, and that is perhaps the most horrifying thing about it. It was organized, documented, and pursued with the cold discipline of legitimate science. The men doing it were not thugs. They were among the most educated people in Japan, doctors and researchers with university degrees and professional reputations, men who went home to their families and thought of themselves as patriots serving a noble cause. They filled out reports, they took photographs, they kept meticulous records because the entire point was to produce data, and data had to be gathered carefully to be useful.
And the data was meant to be used. Unit 731 was never merely a research facility. It was a weapons program, and Ishii intended his weapons to be deployed. They were. Japanese aircraft dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, seeding epidemics that killed civilians who had never seen the inside of the compound. Wells were poisoned, food was contaminated and left for hungry villagers to find. In the province of Zhejiang and elsewhere, entire communities were struck with outbreaks of diseases that did not belong there, unleashed deliberately from the sky. The true death toll from these field operations will never be known with certainty, but the most sober estimates place it in the hundreds of thousands, and some run higher. Ishii, all the while, prospered. He was promoted, decorated, and treated as a valuable asset by a military that saw his work as a genuine strategic advantage. He was reportedly a heavy drinker and a frequent visitor to Harbin's brothels, a man who indulged himself freely while the people in his prison block died by the thousands. He had built exactly what he set out to build, and for a time it seemed he might get away with it entirely. Then, in the summer of 1945, the war Japan had been losing for years finally came crashing down. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union poured across the Manchurian border, and the empire Ishii had served collapsed. As Soviet tanks advanced toward Harbin, the men of Unit 731 received their final order, and it was an order to erase everything.
They worked frantically. The remaining prisoners, the last of the maruta, were killed so that none could survive to testify. Their bodies were burned, the buildings were dynamited. Documents were hauled out and destroyed by the truckload. Ishii ordered his staff to scatter and disappear back into civilian life, and he swore them all to a lifelong oath of silence. He is said to have warned them that they were to take the secret of what they had done to their graves, and that if any of them ever spoke, he would find them. Then he fled south, back to Japan, carrying with him the one thing he understood was now his only currency: knowledge. Ishii even staged his own death. Word was put out in his home village that the general had been killed, and a mock funeral was reportedly held to sell the story. It did not work for long. When American forces occupied Japan, intelligence officers began hearing rumors about a vast biological warfare program in Manchuria and the doctor who had run it. They started asking questions. And here, the story turns from horror to something colder, something that implicates not just a Japanese war criminal, but the government that was supposed to bring men like him to justice. The United States wanted what was inside Shiro Ishii's head. The men who interrogated him understood quickly what they were dealing with. Ishii and his colleagues had spent more than a decade doing something no Western scientist had ever done or would ever be permitted to do. They had tested biological weapons on living human beings at scale and recorded the results. To American researchers at Fort Detrick, the Army's own biological warfare center, this was a treasure beyond price. Human experimental data could not be gathered any other way. The ethical walls that constrained American science were exactly the walls Ishii had spent years tearing down. His files, whatever survived, represented a shortcut through territory the United States could not otherwise cross.
And the timing sharpened everything. The war against Japan was over, but a new confrontation was already taking shape. The Soviet Union had captured some of Ishii's men in Manchuria and was interrogating them. If the Soviets got Ishii's full body of research and the Americans did not, then in the emerging Cold War, the enemy would hold a biological advantage. That fear, the fear of the data falling into Soviet hands, became the argument that overrode everything else. So a bargain was proposed, and it was breathtaking in its cynicism. Ishii and his fellow scientists would hand over their research, their reports, their samples, everything they had learned from the tables at Pingfong. In exchange, the United States would grant them immunity. There would be no war crimes trial. There would be no punishment. The men who had frozen prisoners alive and dissected them without anesthetic would be protected by the very nation that was at that same moment hanging Nazi doctors at Nuremberg for far less. The negotiations were documented. American investigators wrote reports acknowledging in plain language that the Japanese scientists had conducted human experiments and recommending that the information be acquired and that immunity be granted to secure it. One report noted that the data was of enormous value and that it could be obtained for a fraction of the true cost of the research, a cost that had been paid in human lives that the report treated as a completed transaction. The scientific fruit of mass murder was being weighed on a ledger, and the men doing the weighing decided it was worth buying. Ishii, for his part, negotiated from a position of surprising strength. He knew what he was holding. He understood that the Americans wanted his data badly enough to swallow their revulsion, and he pressed his advantage. He offered not just his files, but himself, proposing to write up a full account of 2 decades of human experimentation, and he reportedly asked for guarantees in writing that he and his associates would never be prosecuted. He behaved less like a captured war criminal begging for mercy and more like a merchant setting terms. That confidence tells you how well he had read the men across the table. He had spent his career reading powerful men and giving them what they wanted, and he did it one last time when it mattered most. There was resistance. Some within the American government were appalled and argued that these men should stand trial, that shielding them made a mockery of everything the war had supposedly been fought to defend. There were voices insisting that a nation which had just helped hang doctors in Germany could not, in good conscience, hand a quiet pardon to their equals in Asia. The Soviets, who were prosecuting some captured Unit 731 members in their own courts, pushed for Ishii to be handed over and tried publicly. And at those trials in Khabarovsk, the details of the program were laid bare in testimony that the wider world simply ignored at the time. But the American authorities running occupied Japan had made their choice. They dismissed the Soviet accusations as propaganda, kept Ishii out of Soviet reach, and quietly closed the file. The deal held, and the paperwork that recorded it was stamped, filed, and locked away where no one would read it for a generation.
And so Shiro Ishii,
a man responsible for one of the most systematic campaigns of medical torture in human history, was allowed to go free. He was never charged. He was never named at the Great Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, where other Japanese leaders were tried and some were executed. His program was simply left out of the story, erased from the official record as thoroughly as he had tried to erase it himself in the ruins of Pingfang. He returned to private life. He is believed to have continued advising on medical matters in the years that followed, though the details remain deliberately murky, buried under decades of classification and silence. He lived on for another decade and a half. He watched his country rebuild. He grew old, and in 1959, Shiro Ishii died of throat cancer at home, surrounded by family, an old man who had gotten away with everything. There was no reckoning, no confession that reached the public, no moment where the world looked him in the eye and named what he had done. The screams from the tables at Unit 731 never reached a courtroom. For decades afterward, the whole affair remained hidden. The survivors of the program kept their oath. The American government kept its files sealed. Japan, for its part, largely declined to confront what had been done in its name, and generations of school children grew up learning nothing about Pingfang. The truth surfaced slowly, dragged into the light over many years by dogged historians, by a handful of former unit members who finally broke their silence in old age and confessed to what they had done, and by the gradual declassification of documents that governments had hoped would stay buried forever. What emerged was a portrait not just of one man's cruelty, but of a moral failure that reached far beyond him. Ishii was a monster, but he did not act alone, and he was not the only one who escaped judgment. Hundreds of people worked at Unit 731. Many of them returned to ordinary Japanese society after the war and went on to successful, respectable careers. Some became professors at prestigious universities. Some rose to lead pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions. The men who counted human beings as logs put on their suits, resumed their lives, and were honored as pillars of the community. The knowledge they had gathered through torture may well have fed, in ways impossible to fully trace, into the post-war science of two nations. This is the part of the story that lingers longest. It would be easier if it ended with Ishii as a lone villain, a singular aberration whose evil died with him. But the truth is heavier than that. His crimes were enabled by a system that rewarded him, protected by a government that needed him, and buried by two countries that found it more convenient to forget than to confront. The victims, the thousands who died at Pingfang, and the many more who died in the poisoned villages, got no trial, no monument, no justice. Their names, for the most part, were never even recorded. They were logs, and logs leave no gravestones. There is a temptation, looking back, to imagine that the people who made these choices were somehow different from us, that only a broken world could produce men who would trade immunity for the fruits of torture. But the men who cut the deal with Shiro Ishii were not cartoon villains. They were intelligent, capable people who told themselves they were serving a greater good, protecting their country, staying ahead of a dangerous enemy. They convinced themselves that the data was too valuable to waste, that justice was a luxury they could not afford, that the dead were already dead and nothing could bring them back. Every terrible bargain in history has been justified with reasoning that sounded, in the moment, entirely sensible. Shiro Ishii died believing he had won. In the narrow sense, he had. He escaped the noose, kept his freedom, and took most of his secrets with him. But the silence he demanded did not last forever. The oath was broken. The files were opened. The survivors on the other side of the wire, the ones who lived in the villages he poisoned, and the descendants of those who died on his tables, remembered. And now the record exists, however incomplete, of what he did and what was done to shield him.
The question that remains is not really about Ishii at all. It is about the price of knowledge and who decides what it is worth. When the United States chose to protect a mass murderer because his research was useful, it made a calculation that the value of information could outweigh the demand for justice. That calculation did not end in 1946. It is a calculation that powerful institutions make again and again whenever expediency collides with conscience. And it is worth asking how often the ledger still comes out on the side of the man with the useful secrets. Shiro Ishii walked free because someone decided that what he knew was worth more than what he had done. That decision was made by the country that hanged other men for less, and the thousands who died to produce his knowledge were, in the end, simply written off the books.